When you were testifying earlier, you were actually responding to questions that were posed by another colleague from Texas. One of the questions was, who was the president in 2008? And to be clear, Obama ran in 2008, but Obama did not swear in until 2009. So when my colleague asked about invasions from Russia, actually in 2008, Russia was invading Georgia, and it was another Texan that was the president at the time, and that was George Bush. In addition to that, one of the things that my colleague did not inquire about, but I want to make sure we're clear about, is that Trump was president in 2019 when he threatened to withhold aid to the Ukrainians as they were being threatened by the Russians. So I do want to make sure that we do that. You know, what is wild to me is that this word patriot seems to be getting co-opted for propagandists, because that's what they do. All right, so we're going to talk about what my colleague from Georgia, she talked about misinformation, and I don't know what she was talking about, but nevertheless, we can look at her own tweets and we can find plenty of misinformation, but we're just going to go through one specific tweet. Now, she said that we need to work with Israel to track down the serial numbers on any U.S. weapons used by Hamas against Israel. Dr. Snyder, I may be going out on a limb, but are you aware that that was actually just propaganda that was put out and there actually were not U.S. weapons that were being used by Hamas as she attempted to insinuate in this tweet?
I mean, first of all, I appreciate the clarification. I knew that the question, who were the American presidents, was going to be the toughest one I got from that side. So I appreciate your helping me out. Yes, I mean, obviously there what you have is a typical example of American-Russian messaging where the implicit idea is supposed to be we shouldn't give weapons to Ukraine because they're going to end up going somewhere else. There's no evidence for that. It's hard to think of an example where American weapons have been leveraged with such success as on the Ukrainian battlefield.
Thank you so much. In fact, for some people, especially people that serve on the committee, they may be surprised to know that it's actually a former Russian president and Putin's sidekick, Dmitry, and I don't want to slaughter his name, so I'm going to say Dmitry M., who actually she quote tweeted. See, the problem that we're having, and the reason that we're bringing up Russia as well, is because Russia is a threat as well as China. So we are not going to sit here and pretend as if it's only one or the other. But the biggest problem that we have is we have people that sit in this chamber and they spread the misinformation. If it was left in Russia or China, whatever. But the problem is that you have people that sit in positions of power and they have a $2 million budget. You think that they would call on some staff to find out if they were telling the truth about the things that they're putting on social media, but instead it works for their rhetoric. And as we talk about rhetoric, something else that was appalling to me was this insinuation that when you look at the Ukrainians, which is why we're having problems getting the funding that Ukraine needs, is because people in this chamber push misinformation and disinformation. They want to talk about the Ukrainians got all of these Nazis. Well, let me tell you something. You can find Nazis anywhere. You can find them right here in the United States. In fact, a bunch of the people that they're calling victims and prisoners of war, also known as convicted felons from January 6th, I have an article that I'd like to enter into the record by unanimous consent that says neo-Nazi January 6th rioter pleads guilty.
Without objection.
Thank you so much. So here's the point. We have people in this chamber that are actually causing just as much a threat, if not more of a threat, to our own country. We should be talking about holding our very own accountable for the misinformation and disinformation that they are spreading, whether it's coming out of China, whether it's coming out of Russia, or whoever is peddling it. It is a problem because right now what we see is that people are dying and we cannot get the support that we need from the public because they continue to peddle lies. And I'm tired of it because I didn't come to this chamber to play games. I came to this chamber to answer to the people, the American people, and to make sure that we keep the American people safe. And if we don't get something done, as they talk about the border, I do want to be clear, the only reason we haven't gotten funding for the border is because they killed, the House Republicans here, killed the bill that they actually sent us from the Senate side. If they want to do some work, let me tell you something, the Democrats are ready, and it seems like the Senate Republicans are ready too. They just need to get to it and stop peddling Putin's lies. Thank you, and I yield.
Gentlelady yields back. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today as we address the greatest threat to America's national security, the Chinese Communist Party.
Here today. The Chinese Communist Party has adopted Russian propaganda efforts to interfere in our elections and advance its own objectives. We should address that issue seriously, and we can and must do so without stigmatizing and discriminating against people based on their identities. Racial slurs are not a national security strategy. They do nothing to help counter the threat posed by the CCP. Mr. Meidas, in a June 2023 tweet, you wrote that equating the Chinese Communist Party to Chinese culture is, quote, racist by any other name, end quote. I agree. Distinguishing between a political party and an entire race of people and its culture is important, and we have the moral responsibility to make that clear, yet it's lost on some. Mr. Meidas, what is the harm in equating China's ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, with all people of Chinese descent?
One, because the history of China is far bigger than the Chinese Communist Party. It is one of the world's great civilizations. There contains, whether you accept the way in which the current sort of minority structure is described or not, it includes a lot of different people from different places that have come together or have been sort of defined as Chinese in the last 170 years. Another reason is that there are a lot of Chinese Americans who are Chinese people who came to this United States and have chosen to become citizens. I remember a classmate of mine at University of Washington was 7th generation Chinese, which is more American than I am by any measure that counts. And to pretend that they are somehow represented by the Chinese Communist Party rather than their local politicians, their elected congressional members and their state senators and governors and president, I think it dismisses the choices that they or their family have made.
Thank you. Anti-Asian racism is pervasive in this country. Republican rhetoric and policies have helped to normalize it. In March 2020, Donald Trump tweeted the racist phrase, quote, China virus, end quote, in reference to COVID-19. In the week that followed, there was a significant increase in anti-Asian content on Twitter, as well as an increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans, according to a 2021 study. I ask for unanimous consent to enter this study from the American Journal of Public Health into the record.
Without objection, to ordered.
Mr. Meidas, how can Congress address the CCP without contributing to xenophobia?
The first is to continue making such distinctions, because even if they are semantic in terms of policies, they help us frame in our own head, in our own mind, what it is that we should be focused on and how our efforts should be guided. The second is that I firmly believe that we have a shortage of China expertise for all of the different departments in the government, and finding ways, either through the creation of an open source center, as Colonel Newsham mentioned, the sort of the recreation of the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, but he's really discussing its public dissemination issue to make information available. Because at the end of the day, our federal government and law enforcement will focus on illegal behavior, and that's where we want it in a democracy. But what we're talking about is often unacceptable but still legal behavior, and that's something that has to be guided by a discussion in civil society about how we govern ourselves and how we deal with each other as citizens.
Thank you very much. The AAPI community has seen a sharp increase in discrimination and race-based violence since the start of the pandemic. There were 158 anti-Asian hate crimes in the country in 2019. This number jumped to 746 in 2021, nearly 5 times higher. Our constituents are depending on us to help them, not endanger them with racist rhetoric. As a proud member of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, my hope is that Congress will prioritize policies that affirm and protect the AAI members of our community, like the Southeast Asian Deportation Relief Act, and stop contributing to hateful acts against them. And finally, Professor Snyder, when political leaders normalize racist language that pits one group against another, does it make our country more or less safe?
As our adversaries know and seek to exploit, it makes us less safe.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Ms. Green from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a very important hearing we're having today, and I'd like to take a little time to respond to some misinformation that has been spread here. Mr. Snyder, you said in your opening statement that the fact that there are neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian military is disinformation, a disinformation trope, and a Russian denazification meme. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record this 2021 Time magazine article titled "How a White Supremacist Militia Uses Facebook to Radicalize and Train New Members" about the Ukrainian neo-Nazi Azov Battalion.
Without objection to order.
Thank you. Time also put together a piece only 3 years ago, and it's quite an extensive video that gives full information about the Nazis in Ukraine and their recruitment efforts that go all around the world. It's amazing to me that just in a few years' time, it's now considered misinformation to talk about the Nazis in Ukraine. I'd like to quote the article. It says that Ali Sufan, a security consultant and former FBI agent who has studied Azov Nazis, estimates that more than 17,000 foreign fighters have come to Ukraine over the past 6 years from 50 countries. According to Christopher Wray, the FBI director, he said that Azov has been recruiting and radicalizing and training American citizens for years. He also finished saying in his testimony to the U.S. Senate that American white supremacists are actually traveling overseas to train. This is an extremely concerning situation. I don't think anyone in the United States government, Americans, do not support actual Nazis or white supremacists. I know I certainly do not. And I can't understand why in just a short amount of time, this information that our own American media frequently talked about is no longer talked about. I'd like to point out also, here's an NBC article stating that Ukraine's Nazi problem is real. Mr. Snyder, do you see this headline? This is NBC News. They say that Ukraine's Nazi problem is real, even if Putin's denazification claim is not. So even our own American media, unless you consider NBC or Time Magazine misinformation spreaders or disinformation media outlets, this is contrary to what you testified. And there's frequent pictures all over. Anybody can find them of Nazis. Here they are. This looks like something you'd see out of Hitler's Germany from Ukraine. And this is something that's extremely important to talk about. According to the Council of Europe, however, Ukraine is ranked well in the top half of countries in terms of how corrupt they are. In the last 5 years, Ukraine is ranked close to the countries like Gambia, Iran, Myanmar, and Sierra Leone in corruption. That's not very free and democratic company to keep. Ukraine has canceled their elections, arrested members of the press, not allowed different types of religion unless it goes along with the Ukrainian government. And right now, the biggest push in Washington, D.C. is to fund the Ukraine war with another $60 billion. And while we're talking about the CCP, I think it's extremely important to point out that our own wide-open border is the most dangerous threat to our national security. According to CBP data, there have been 24,296 Chinese nationals enter the United States at the southern border just this year in 2024. I want you to know that's up 7,000% since Biden took office in 2021, when only 342 Chinese nationals crossed our border. When we're talking about national security and talking about threats through the United States, Congress needs to remember that our open border is the greatest threat to the American people who, by the way, Monday was tax day, April 15th, when struggling Americans pulled together to pay their taxes, or filed for extensions or paid money that they just didn't have and desperately are hoping for a tax return. The United States federal government is doing everything they can here in Congress, persuading members of Congress with every lobbyist from foreign countries and groups, trying to tell us to send $100 billion overseas, and we're doing nothing for our border. So when you want to talk about misinformation, Mr. Snyder, you might actually look a little closer to American media if you don't like what they're saying. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, does he have the opportunity to respond to the gentlelady?
Sure.
Yeah.
I didn't ask him a question,
No, her
Mr.
time's
Raskin.
expired.
You asked multiple questions.
I did not ask him a question.
You certainly did. You said, did you see this?
Time has expired. Gentlelady's time's expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Frost from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into it, it's interesting to hear my colleague just now talk about disavowing white supremacists when in 2022, she spoke at an event led...
Should we use the expression made to sit on his backside with doorknobs and keep quiet in the corner? That's a very polite way of describing Jamie Raskin literally obliterating to his face, by the way, to his face, James, I have nothing, coma.
So
Well,
it's
what are your
okay.
bank
It's
statements
okay
show?
for, as Tony Bobolinsky said, for China to bribe Joe Biden's family with $9 million.
But that's the lie that's been discredited. I mean, where is your impeachment investigation? If Joe Biden took a $9 million bribe from China, why aren't you impeaching him for that?
Well, who says we're not?
Well, I can invite Mr. Moskowitz to come back in. Do you want to move for impeachment today? Because I thought that was your main agenda item. You said it was the paramount priority of the committee.
No, this is a...